Good morning. Welcome to the SBC Daily Word for Wednesday, January 27th, 2021. Again, as I look at these dates for each of these SBC Daily Words, it's hard to comprehend how quick this first month of 2021 has gone. But part of that, I've enjoyed just these 3 weekly times where we look at a section of scripture, and we've been spending these first few days, almost month now, of 2021 looking at this letter of James. James, again, we believe of the different Jameses in the New Testament. This is likely James, the brother of Jesus. This is James, who became a leader in the church at Jerusalem, and he's writing to a community that he calls of the dispersion. And he wants this messianic Jewish community, and by that phrase I mean a bunch of ethnic Jews who, as a unit, have formed a church because together they believe that Jesus is Lord and Messiah. Just like it says in the sermons in Acts, Jesus is this Jewish king who, through his death, resurrection, and ascension, is proclaimed by God, the one who raised him from the dead, as the true king of heaven and earth. And this takes a measure of faith for James' original audience because they are suffering, much like many of the Jews in the Jewish scriptures. They experience the presence of God while they are in exile. And what James wants his Jewish community to do is find covenant faithfulness through following Jesus. Jesus being the faithful Son of God, whose faithfulness is now given to them as a gift, and then having had their unfaithfulness forgiven, they are then called to follow Jesus and become what God says is true of them. So we're in James chapter 3. The paragraph we're going to be looking at is verses 13 to 18. And to kind of set the stage, one of the things that we've got to keep in mind is the context in which this paragraph is found. It's in chapter 3. There's a lot of different places that we could look, but I want to draw our attention to the first verses of chapter 3. This is a time when the chapter choices by the editors is helpful because a unit begins here that now this section that we're going to look at today concludes. So look at verse 1 again. Not many of you should become teachers, my brothers and sisters, for you know that we who teach will be judged with greater strictness. So there seems to be within James' community this problem of teachers and the effect that their teaching is having on the community. So what James is going to address now in this passage is what makes for a good teacher? What makes for a teacher that we can describe? Look at verse 13, who is wise and understanding among you. So again, in this paragraph, he's not necessarily talking to just individual Christians. He's talking to this group of Christians to say, here's how we can know this teaching is from God. Now, this is particularly relevant in our day and age, because especially during this pandemic, and hopefully we're getting towards the end of it and we'll be able to start to look towards a return to a new normal. We live in kind of a marketplace of Christian teaching. Way back in March of 2020, the first stay-at-home orders were issued in our area. And all of a sudden, pastors, no matter the size of their church, had to go into this mode of quick learning, quick adapting. And we had to figure out, how can we do discipleship in a way that is not going to compromise the health of our community, our neighborhood, our church family? So most of us went online. And then once you make that step, all of a sudden you're a part of this marketplace of Christian teaching. And I'll be honest, as a pastor of a small rural congregation, it's a bit intimidating. to go into this online world where other bigger churches with bigger budgets, with different staff members, with different cameras, with different lighting, with ways to make the preacher look a little bit more professional, and look a little bit less pastory, and to kind of go into that marketplace of Christian teaching was something that took some courage. And I understand that if you're going to watch church online, there's probably a lot better products out there than what a small rural congregation in Northern Illinois can put together. So I'm not going to pretend to think that there aren't other churches that perhaps you have been or participating with through online worship gatherings. So here's the question then to consider. What kind of Christian teaching should I listen to? What makes for Christian teaching that is worth our time? So, James chapter 3, starting in verse 13. Who is wise and understanding among you? Show by your good life that your works are done with gentleness, born of wisdom. So he begins with a question to kind of introduce the topic. So it's like James is saying, okay, I understand that there's kind of some problems there related to teaching and teachers. Let me give you now some basic principles of the type of teacher that you should be able to regard as wise and having understanding. So he introduces the question, and then he says this to teachers. Show, second half of verse 13, by your good life that your works are done with gentleness, born of wisdom. So this is this idea of living a life that is characterized by wisdom, and then it's a certain type of wisdom. Our translation has this idea of gentleness. It's really difficult for us in English to find one word that captures the original language here underneath our English translation. This word has with it this idea of non-showy wisdom, non-retaliatory wisdom. In other words, as a teacher, you should devote yourself to living your life in a way that's characterized by gentleness, by not showiness. Remember in Matthew chapter 6, Jesus says, practice your spirituality in a way not to be seen by others, but instead your Father in heaven sees you in secret and he will reward you in secret. What James is now saying is the lifestyle of a good Christian teacher should be non-showy. It should be devoted to good works. In fact, James has much to say about good works. He talks about good works for the poor. He talks about speech that is controlled. So again, the question is, Christian teaching, Christian teachers should have a life that is characterized by good works, caring for the poor, speech that is non-destructive. These are all things that James has spoken of. But again, it's non-showy, and then it's also non-retaliatory. So again, these are the things to consider. Now, if you again look at verses 14 to 16, he's going to talk about this is the type of teaching we shouldn't listen to. But if you have bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not be boastful and false to the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, devilish. For where there is envy and selfish ambition, there will be disorder and wickedness of every kind. So now what James is going to say is Christian teaching should produce a type of wisdom. And wisdom here is this very, very thick, nuanced, biblical idea of skill at living, okay? So now he's going to say, here's the type of wisdom that Christian teachers should have and that Christian teachers should produce. Christian teachers, have a wisdom that comes from a place not of envy and ambition. So Christian teaching is not something that needs to come from a place of, oh, I'm envious of this teacher over here and and how many views and how many likes and how many comments are made about the sermon that he posted on Facebook Live or how many subscribers he has on YouTube. That if any of our Christian teaching comes from that place, that teaching motivated by envy and ambition never comes from a good place. And again, this is timely words for now going on 10, 11 months of doing so much of our preaching and teaching online. Brothers and sisters, I confess feeling conflicted doing so much of this Christian teaching online. It can't come from a place of envy and ambition. Now, that's a complicated question because then you're starting to say, I think that preacher, that teacher is coming from a place of envy or ambition, so I'm going to judge him and not watch his videos. James actually doesn't let us go there. Instead, what James does is now says, okay, don't get into judging teachers' motives. Instead, ask yourself this question: what kind of fruit does this teaching develop in my life? Which is now what he's going to discuss in verse 17. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without a trace of partiality or hypocrisy, and a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace for those who make peace. So there's a way of teaching that is about partiality. There's a way of teaching that's arrogant and not willing to yield. There's a way of teaching that's about dividing up between this ism and this ism and this political position or this theological position versus this political position or this theological position. And what James is saying is teaching wisdom that comes from above doesn't have a hint of that in it. Christian teachers, Christian teaching should produce a type of wisdom. The type of wisdom that it produces is a way of being, is a way of inhabiting the world, is a way of doing life that looks like peace. So, how can we apply this text to our life? First, mastery of theological content is not sufficient for Christian teaching. We've been spending, as a church family, over probably the past 2 or 3 years, a lot of time in the Gospels. That's something that I felt convicted about, that as a Christian congregation, we found ourselves spending a lot of time in the epistles, a lot of time in the Old Testament. There's a time and a place for that, but it seemed as though we weren't spending a lot of time in the Gospels. So we've been in Luke, we've been in John, we've spent some time in Matthew, and then now this year we're spending some time in Mark. A lot of this year we're going to spend in the Gospel of Mark. We're going to spend some time in Lent in the Gospel of John. And here's one of the things that has just become so important to me over the past several years about how little Jesus has to say about being doctrinally correct, about having a certain theology mastered. Now, I'm a theology guy. I'm a doctrine guy. I care about good, sound, orthodox doctrine, and that's something we will never abandon. Yet, as a matter of emphasis, one of the things as I spend more time with Jesus in the Gospels is he is equally concerned, if not more concerned, with Christian behavior as he is compared to Christian doctrine. In Matthew 25, at the end of the age, all of the nations are gathered. And the thing that separates as a nation sheep from goats has very, very little to do with doctrine. It has to do with good deeds to which Jesus calls us for the prisoner, the hungry, the thirsty, the sick, the naked. Beloved, mastery of theological content is not sufficient in a teacher. I think it's interesting that as James describes what makes for a good and wise teacher, a teacher that can be described as having wisdom and understanding, he has very little to say about content and instead has more to say about the deeds of the teacher and then the deeds of the student that were taught by that teacher. That ultimately it's not so much about mastering content, it's about deeds. Brothers and sisters, does our teaching produce good works? Secondly, are you able to observe the good life and works of your primary Christian teachers? Now, I understand the age that we live in, the many resources that we have available to us. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with you listening to the mega church pastor who has the huge church in San Diego or the huge church in Dallas. I'm not saying you shouldn't avail yourselves of that teacher's gifts. But here's my question. As James describes the primary Christian teaching in our lives, what does he ask us to do? To the teachers, show by your good life that your works are done with gentleness, born of wisdom. The normal Christian life, according to James, the brother of Jesus, is Christian teaching in our lives, given to us by a gifted teacher in a congregation whose life we can observe. Whose life we could say to that Christian teacher, I've seen your life. I've seen the way you treat your spouse. I've seen the way you treat your kids. I've seen the way you treat your neighbors. I've seen the way you treat your coworkers. And your life is characterized by good works born of wisdom. Do we have a relationship with this Christian teacher that extends beyond a screen? Brothers and sisters, James says to us, our Christian teachers, we should have such a relationship with them that we can observe their lives and see that their lives are characterized by good works born of gentle wisdom. Again, it's not a good works that are done for the sake of social media posts. I mean, there's Christian comedians that ask questions like, if I go on a mission trip and don't post it on Facebook, did it really happen? That we live in such a social media age that we've got to post a selfie of us doing what we did at the orphanage in this country. And ultimately, that reminds us of Jesus, who says, when you give to the poor, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. In other words, conceal it so that you can know that what we are being motivated by is our Father in heaven seeing these things. Brothers and sisters, it is not the normal Christian life according to the New Testament for us to have teaching that only comes to us through a screen. Finally, do your Christian teachers lead you to wise and gentle living? Brothers and sisters, one of my professors from Dallas Seminary said this recently on social media. I've been bashing social media during this devotional, but this was wise. He said, warning, powerful preaching can often mask terrible teaching. Michael Spiegel. Powerful preaching can often mask terrible teaching. Brothers and sisters, there are good communicators online whose lives are characterized by conflict, by anger, by division, by a lack of peace. Just because somebody is a good communicator doesn't mean that what they are teaching is going to lead us to wise and gentle living. So here's my question. What fruit is born by the teaching that we receive? I think James perhaps might have on mind this incident that Matthew describes in Matthew chapter 12. I just want to read the kind of teacher Jesus was, because it reminds me of the type of teacher James wants his people to hear from. Jesus left that place and entered their synagogue. A man was there with a withered hand, and they asked him, "Is it lawful to cure on the Sabbath?" so that they might accuse him. He said to them, "Suppose one of you has only one sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath. Will you not lay hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a human being than a sheep? So it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." Then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and it was restored, as sound as the other. But the Pharisees went out and conspired against him, how to destroy him. When Jesus became aware of this, he departed. You see, good deeds. And then he was even willing to yield to this opposition. Many crowds followed Jesus, and he cured all of them, and he ordered them not to make him known. Don't post this on Twitter. Don't post this on Instagram. Don't put this on your story on Snapchat. Please keep it off Facebook. I don't want people aware of this. This was to fulfill his retreating from the Pharisees when they oppose him, for healing a man's withered hand, and his telling his followers about, don't tell others about these miraculous things you're witnessing. This was to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet Isaiah. "Here is my servant whom I have chosen, my beloved with whom my soul is well pleased. I will put my spirit upon him, and he will proclaim justice to the Gentiles. He will not wrangle or cry aloud, nor will anyone hear his voice in the streets. He will not break a bruised reed or quench a smoldering wick until he brings justice to victory, and in his name the Gentiles will hope." Brothers and sisters, it seems as though the good and wise teacher that James is describing in James chapter 3 looks an awful lot like Jesus. So here's a good question. A question that I think you should be free to ask of me if I serve as your pastor. Does the teaching resemble and produce a life that looks like Jesus? May grace and peace and everything good be yours.